Salve a tutti, faremo oggi questa lezione in inglese, quindi spero che per voi non ci siano problemi. Dunque, il nostro ospite è il professor Walter Hood. Walter Hood, architect, designer, educator, artist, and a community whisperer. We will discover how and why in this today meeting, for which I'm very grateful to Walter and honored to have him here with us. Actually, I was lucky meeting Walter in my city, Rome, in 1997, while he was a fellow in landscape architecture at the American Academy in Rome. We immediately became good friends, and walking randomless through the city at night, especially at night, we shared a lot of interesting conversations about art and architecture, history and memory, aesthetics and environment. At that time, our best friend was, and still is, Giordano Bruno in Campo dei Fiori. And that means that love for research and knowledge, love for resisting injustice, and love for intellectual freedom. Three basic elements in Walter Hood's profile. After a long time, I was lucky again meeting Walter in his city this time, San Francisco, 2 years ago. He was so generous, showing me and explaining the essence of a complex urban environment such as San Francisco, and how public spaces can revitalize neighborhood. I visited then a Hood Design Studio in Oakland, his firm, that is also a cultural practice committed to creating environments in which people live, work, and play. Back to 1997, he gave me a special gift, a very small but powerful watercolor from a series of drawings called Urban Diaries. That watercolor was the clear symptom of his artistic need to express himself. At that time, in fact, Walter was a bold architect, but a shy artist. Yet today, I think he has reached his own equilibrium, being a landscape architect and a public artist at the same time. Walter is also profoundly devoted to teaching, to the teaching process and experience. He is professor and former chair of landscape architecture and environmental planning and professor of urban design at the University of California, Berkeley, at College of Environmental Design. And probably one of the most enthusiastic lessons of yours, Walter, is the one you gave on TED, which moved me a lot, and I suggest you to listen to it as soon as you can on the internet. It was 2018, I think.
Yes.
Yes. Walter has received a lot of important international prizes and commissions. He's a star in the US, but don't say that. You just came back yesterday from the International Biennial in Venice, curated by Leslie Locco, and we are starving to know everything about that experience. Today I asked Walter to talk about his life and his career, showing us images of all his major projects and possibly explaining his principles and ideas. And at the end we can make some questions to him if we want. So please, Walter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm glad to be here, and it's good to see that this is just students, so I can be very informal, right? And not to say that you guys are not students. Miriam has been, as she said, a friend for the last 25 years. It seems like a long time. But she has been a great colleague and a friend, particularly coming back to Rome. And I have to say, spending a year in Rome, and I know a lot of you are foreigners, for me, it really changed my life. It made me see the place that I live in a completely different way. And it took me on a journey that I thought I never would even sort of start on, and some of the questions that I began to sort of ask. One of the things that I really, how can I say, respect for those who want to work in a place is to live in a place, right? And there are a lot of people who move around different places. But like Rome, I like, when I come back to Rome, Rome is still Rome, but the people are older, right? Your friends in the cafe. And it's the same thing. I've been in one place for the last 30 years. And what that does is, one, you're part of a community, and there's always a place to return to that is familiar. And it builds an ethos that I think is really fantastic, you know, that allows you to really kind of think about what it is you want to do. And so this idea of environmental justice, when we talk about it today, we might talk about sustainability, we might talk about poverty, we might talk about race, but it encompasses a lot of things. But I think for architects, we don't have ways to talk about these things, so we shy away from them. And so this idea of memory and history and embracing, it's too light.
Maybe there's too light. Can we?
And so this idea of memory and history, and then what we like to talk about in the studio is embracing the strange, stranissimo, right? I mean, things that make you kind of think. And so in really thinking about memory in my class, I use an old text by Lowenthal in English, I think he's a geographer, where he talks about different ways to remember. And for my students, I try to get them to be very clear about how they want to think about it. And Lowenthal talks about this idea of the tangible past. You know, he talks about the collective, the irrecoverable, the ostensible, the altered, and the invented. And if you listened or have any interest in America today, we are definitely living in an ostensible past, right? We also are living in an altered past, and we're living in an invented past. And so for our last 8 years, when we think of like Make America Great Again, what it is trying to do is reinvent things from a different place, where I would say the collective communal associations of the past, particularly during the early 21st century, that was something that we could all get behind, that people were beginning to discover that we are all tied together, but we find forces always separating us. And I'll give you a good example of this. When I was in high school in North Carolina, this is in the 70s, there was a sculpture placed in my downtown. And this was Palmanova, an Italian futurist, right? And it was a very strange thing for me to see this big disc. And when he talked about it, he talked about a future that was not about people, but a future that hadn't been discovered, right? And for 20 years, this sculpture sat in the middle of my city as a beacon to the future. And then people said, no, we want to change. And so in 1990, they came up with a new future. They removed the Pomodoro and pushed it to the side, and now they have these 4 figures. And when I went home 2 years ago, I see this. It's like, what is this, right? And I started to read underneath each one. And now they say on the left, North Charlotte started with gold. I'm like, gold? Charlotte is a place for work. And then there is a black man, like right there, and they say he worked on the railroad. Now you have to remember North Carolina was in the South. So he was a slave. So now in the center of my city, there is a slave that represents supposedly something good. And this is a completely invented past. And the banks really love this because now when people come downtown, particularly people who don't look like me, particularly white people, they are happy because now they have a past that reinforces themselves. And this is very shocking for me at times. And I love these 2 images because on one side, this is American Gothic, and this is a picture taken by a very famous photographer, African-American photographer, of a maid working in Washington, D.C., but that's the other side of America. So you have this duality that's constantly at play, and that's something that we are trying to reckon in America today. But at the end of the day, for me, it's really what's in your heart. You know, it's how we kind of think about loving one another that we can actually begin to kind of build a conversation. And so in a lot of my work, you know, we're constantly trying to, you know, dig. Again, these are recent paintings called palimpsest. And again, I'm reminded of Rome, of like digging. And so in a lot of my work, I try to dig. And then I bring things to the surface that maybe people don't know. So I'm going to show you a few projects very quickly that begin to describe this way of thinking. If you've ever been to San Francisco, this image probably looks very foreign. This could be Egypt or something, but this is San Francisco in the late 19th century. This is Golden Gate Park. Golden Gate Park was sand. It's at the Pacific. And so someone had an idea, we need to remove the sand and we need to make a park. And so today, you go to Golden Gate Park, this is what they made. And so we worked on this museum here with Herzog and de Meuron out of Basel, and we wanted people to understand that this place was not real. And so we collected all the plants around, and so you go there and we tell you about what's beneath the ground. And so all the plants here are from different places. They're from Australia, they're from Brazil, they're from places that are not local. After this project, we started to work on many museums. The Broad Museum with Diller Scofidio in Los Angeles. This is a fiction. Here we were able to not have land, so we made a bridge, and then we placed 110-year-old olive trees on top. So when people come here, they think these olive trees have been here the whole time, but these olive trees are new. And then you turn the corner and you see that there is no land because the ground is over a tunnel. And this is Los Angeles, and again, trying to get people to kind of see places in a different way. In my hometown in Charlotte and in Oakland, we try to sort of pull out in these landscapes that are really harmful to people. We try to get people to see things differently. And in 2008, when Obama was elected, we made this new gateway that covers the entire street that begins to talk about different people who have been in different places. And we use the infrastructure of the highway to basically tell the story. So again, instead of bringing something new in, we take something from the autostrada, right, the thing that holds the sign, and we put the images together. And in a lot of our work in landscape, we do a lot of different landscapes all over the country. And I want to talk more specifically about the public art projects. But the landscape projects sometimes possess them, but sometimes they're more about getting people to understand the places in which they live. The first project I want to show is a very sad project. It's called the December 2nd Memorial. And 5 years ago, on a Monday morning, a couple, a man and a wife, went in Southern California into the county and killed 17 people. It was during a birthday. And they were Islamic terrorists, basically. And so the entire city came and actually found them, and they had a gunfight. It was very sad, but this is a typical thing in America, right? Every day we read about this. But in particular, in this county, they wanted to create a memorial for the people who were there. And they called my office, and I said, I don't really want to do the memorial. But then the families said, we want a place that we can come and remember. And so we decided to take this on, and we became very fascinated with this idea of the bulletproof vest and protection. Right? This is the site that we chose. It's a very bad site. It's very banal, but this is the place of the government. So every morning, people walk down this place. The light is beautiful because it's in Southern California. The mountains are in the distance. And so we wanted to sort of engage people in a kind of a wrap, almost like a curtain. And the piece is called the Curtain of Courage. And it's laid out very much like a chapel. So each family has a chapel that they can go to and they can remember. And we work with each family to have a keepsake that is inside each alcove. And so during the day, as the light travels across, you have this memory that's constantly being evoked. And each individual has their own separate color. Their family said, she likes pink, she likes red, she likes blue, he likes yellow. And we work with them so that when this piece manifests itself, it becomes a place that begins to describe, right, a setting for remembering, but also a place that's public, and it changed that ugly place that I showed you in the beginning. This just opened last year in the fall, and now there's a place, again, where people can go and actually begin to remember, but also daily people have to pass. And for us, it was like if we can remind people of these things, that maybe people will act. Maybe they will say stop, or maybe they will try to become a politician, or maybe they will do something because we make it visible. And on the opening, the families were very, very happy that there was some place, because in America, when there is a shooting, the next week there's another shooting, so people forget. And so this notion that at one point in time in America, there will be hundreds of places like this, that you will go from city to city. And I think right now there are 25 in different cities. On a more upbeat note, we've been working in this community in Pittsburgh. There's a term called urban renewal in America, where during the 1960s and 70s, neighborhoods were erased, completely erased. I'm trying to think, is there any place like that in Rome where something was erased? Maybe during early fascista, like that. If you think of Via Nazionale, where you go in and you just basically erase something. In this community, things were erased, and so we began to sort of collect images. And part of our work in the studio, we like to use images to, to remember and evoke, but it's also a way to collect and talk to people. And as we collected images from people, they told us their story. And so we have the recordings and we have the images. And some of the images are really beautiful. This woman, this is from the 1950s. I showed this in a lecture. She calls me, she says, "You're showing my picture, I love you." And so, again, people want to be remembered in some way. And so through these collections, we're able then to recall a past that, again, in a lot of cities in America, people want to forget, right? And we decided that we wanted to create these giant facades that would carry these images. And so they sit at the top of the hill, and then as you walk through, you can see these images at the scale of a building. They're not at the scale of the side, but they're like the scale of a building. So you come in, and as you come into them, there's a garden that the water comes through, and each time you come in, there's music that plays. And the music that plays is the music of the neighborhood, because it used to be a place where people played music. And my nephew, who's a rapper, he has now made a soundtrack. So when you come in, you hear this new music, you see the images, and there's a moment where memory collapses. This is in construction today. Project like this has taken 10 years. So for you, when you're making public work, you might have 6 public works in your lifetime. It takes a long time because, again, it's a very different kind of way of thinking, and to get people to see in a different way, you have to work a lot, and you have to be a good storyteller, right? This next project is for the Biennale in Chicago. This was in 2000, right before COVID, 2018. And in the newspaper, they said Obama is building a library and he's cutting down all the trees in Washington and Jefferson Park. And I think to myself, what do I want to make for the Biennale? So we go to the place where the trees were cut down, but the trees were cut down because of the storm, not because of the library. So we collect the wood and we make 3 trees. 1 tree is for Jefferson, 1 tree is for Washington, and you can tell the one for Obama. And the idea was to get people to remember Obama was a president like Lincoln and Jefferson. But again, we have these icons and we don't think of people the same. And this started an interest for me in a kind of renewable sculpture And now we have made maybe 5 of these in different places. At the Biennale, we're using a very similar idea for vanishing landscape in South Carolina, where these people here are from 400 years ago. They were enslaved, and they came to South Carolina, and even today they still have the same dialect, they still have the same families, they married together, and they still have a memory of Africa. And they live in a landscape that's very, very different. Not the suburban landscape, but they live within the woods. And the woods are a way for them to build their community. So at the Biennale this year, we are designing for them specifically to talk about the relationship of a native landscape, native people, native landscape. And in Venice, we are looking at that native landscape, how the city is held up and how people enjoy the city. And so as a series of diagrams, which these did not work out, so I'll go to this, we basically created, again, a set of constructions that are based on 2 things. 1, making a basket, and 2, how a tree grows. And from that, we were able to think about an architecture that can then sit in the landscape. So as you walk through this landscape, the material from the wood makes the architecture. So every year you cut a tree and you make something. And before you know it, you have a landscape that begins to talk about not the suburbs, but talks about a renewal of the material, right? And that material then becomes a story that you can kind of build upon. And in South Carolina, in 2 years, 1 tree will grow maybe 6 meters because it's very, very fertile because it's on the wetland. And so this idea of having a native landscape that actually creates an architecture is something that we're really interested in today. And within the wetland, right, you have this relationship, this balance that's very different than coming in and erasing everything. So at the Biennale, we show these houses, right? We bring them to Italy to show how they are constructed. And within the exhibition, you're able then to understand their relationship. And I found a very similar thing in Venice, where the wood that they use in all of the waterways, it's used to also hold up the city. And the Pellini is a chestnut wood, and there is an entire industry to make the Pellini. So if you go to the edge of the city, you will find the Pellinis there. And so I find a guy who could make something. And so in the Scarpa Garden, we take the Pellini and we make, again, the tree, the same tree that I'm making in South Carolina. And here they hold up the roof. And so this idea of having these 2. And then I saw this painting by Carpaccio that has the Moor, right, from the 15th century with the Pellini. And so for me, again, there's this connection because when I go to Venice, I never think of Black people, but you will see the hand of the Moor everywhere in Venice. And then in the paintings, you will see that the Moors were not gondoliers, they were slaves, but they were slaves to the rich, and so they would actually moor their boats as well. So this is up now in Venice, so if you get a chance to go to Venice, it's a very nice space because it's the only space outside the main pavilion. A project in Southern California called the Crying Stone, St. Monica Tears. In Los Angeles, the Spanish came to California, and all the saints are in Los Angeles, right? St. Monica, St. Matthew's, you go to different places and there's a saint. And I think to myself, why is Santa Monica, right? Because the Spaniards came up and they built the missions. And I began to research St. Monica, and St. Monica, in my way, she came and she cried, right? And when she cried, she made a garden, right? But no one said anything about the Tonga natives who were there. So we mined and we quarried the stone, and we stacked 2 meters by 1 meter on the public sidewalk that you walk by. And every day at sunset, because the space is west, the stone cries. We cast glass, and there are these big tears that come out, right? And as I was making this, a native indigenous person called me and said, I love your project. She said, the Spanish might have cried, but we called it the Crying Rock. And so the name of the piece is Saint Monica and the Crying Rock, because the Spanish took the natives and threw them over the cliffs to kill them. And so when you walk here today, you are reminded of this duality, right? This duality between what was there, because there's no more sandstone. Everything has been cleared, and this is left for you to sort of understand. In North Carolina, which is on the East Coast, where I'm from, there is a place called Winston-Salem. And this was a place where the Moravians, which was a religious group, they founded a community. And this is a story about a slave, a man, who his master takes him to this town, and he sees the Moravians are very, very nice people. They make pots, they make ceramics. And he says to himself, I want them to buy me. So he figures out a way, he talks them into buying him. So when he comes back, they actually purchase him, and then they set him free. He marries, and he owns land here and becomes a potter. So it's a very beautiful story, but forgotten. Everyone forgot. And maybe 5 years ago, someone says, we find the land. And when they found the land, now the highway is on top of the land, right? And so we're now trying to figure out a way to bring back Peter Oliver. As we were doing the research, it turns out Peter Oliver's great-great-great-great-grandson is an NBA basketball player. His name is Chris Paul. You don't know him, but he has lots of money, yeah? And he did not win the championship this year, but he will work with us because his family now wants to make a place for his great-great-great-grandfather. And so over the freeway, we create this giant pavilion that celebrates the life of this black man, this free slave. And it's made of all wood, again, this construction from the local wood. We tell the story of his family. We have a continual sort of timeline that will continue. You are raised above the freeway, so now you can see all of the land that he owned. Where before everyone was down, now you are up. We do exhibitions of the pottery that he makes, the kinds of pottery, and then maybe every 5 years the family can come for a reunion, right? They can come and they celebrate. This is all public, right? But at certain times it can be private, and they are giving it a gift to the city. I know I'm going through a lot of projects, but this shows you the different places. In Washington, D.C., at the end of slavery in Arlington Cemetery, the first free slaves were placed in Arlington Cemetery because Arlington Cemetery was the home of Robert E. Lee, who was the general for the South. This community was there for maybe 30 years. And they were called freedmen, F-R-E-E-D, men. Freed men, freed women. They were not freedom, but they were freed. So they said, you can go now, right? And this idea of a freed person, I think to myself, this is very strange, right? To call someone a freed man, so you would be a freed woman. And so maybe this is the problem, I think, with a lot of black people, that they are afraid that someone will come and say, you must come back. Versus someone who came on a boat for freedom, it's very different because it was self-initiated, right? And so maybe the African American community, there is a psychosis, right? That we're constantly worried that we will be taken back because we did not choose, we were actually confiscated. So in this project, we were asked to design a small little space that would beautify this space, right? And so working with the community, we came up with this idea of Freed. And I wanted there to be a monument to Freed. And this was very controversial because people were like, we don't want people to say freed. And I said, no, we want to say freed. And so it's 40 feet high, and it sits in front of a new condominium where people are not black, but people who come. It's made of gold, and it sits in the most lush landscape. So we have so many plants, water to clean the air, and all of these things. And there's always this sentinel in the back that says freed. And again, this is a very poor community. And so to put this kind of infrastructure in is a very, very important thing. but we also wanted to have this other counterpoint that would constantly engage people and make them think, what is freed? And then there will be conversations. And it catches light. We work with the community they wanted. The different names of the community have been Nok, Green Valley. The names have changed over time. There are Adinkra symbols that talk about this past, the connection back to the early Africans as well. No, you can look through. See, you can see how small it is. Yeah. But it provides, as you come, it provides a memory, right? This idea that it's constantly, you cannot, once you see it, you cannot forget it, right? And I was thinking, when you turn it on its head, it's very abstract. You have to sort of turn your head and look to see. I hope you can understand what that says. What the fuck? This was the opening of a project at Princeton University. This was before George Floyd, so this is 2018. And the students went to the president's house and said, we want Woodrow Wilson's name off the School of Public Policy. Woodrow Wilson was an American president in the early 20th century. It was doing after Reconstruction, but the beginning of Jim Crow. He was very racist to black people. He was very mean to women. He did not help women's suffrage movement, but he also started the university system that you guys actually live in. He's a very complicated man, put it this way. He's from South Carolina, he's from the South. His father was a preacher, and he had a lot of different accomplishments in life. And I was trying to figure out a way to talk about him, because the competition was to talk about his good side and his bad side, which is typical in America now, to not erase him, but to have this duality. And I started to think that maybe I could talk about him through a contemporary of his, and this is W.E.B. Du Bois, and this idea of a double consciousness. And this is a very simple idea, is that if I am walking around, people see me as a black man first, right? And then they expect me to act a certain way. So the idea of wearing a veil, and this is, I think, gender is a very similar situation. And this veil forces you to reinterpret yourself based on how people see you, right? So you cannot be yourself. But certain people do not have to wear the veil, and these are privileged people, right? Privileged people can just do what they want to do, right? And so I think to myself, can I give him a consciousness through this idea? The project is located in the center of campus in a very quiet place sometimes, and very loud place. I think this is going to work. Let me go back. Sorry. Something's supposed to happen, but in these two things, there's two columns, a white column and a black column. And maybe I can do this. And one supports the other. Yeah. And for me, it's a very simple idea, right? That within America, America is supported, right? Whiteness is supported by all the others, right? And I wanted this to be finished, I'm gone, but they wanted it to be more didactic. So as we started to think about it, we started to add other things to it, like on the white column and black column, we worked with the academics. Everything Woodrow Wilson has written is on the columns. It's like a cartouche. I mean, everything, unedited. Some things are good, some things are bad. Some things are racist, some things are sexist, but we keep it there. It's located in the center. We removed 2 trees and we placed them there. And then some of the quotes by the contemporaries we put on the inside. So if you take a square and you cut it diagonally and turn it, you get a wider face. It's the hypotenuse, right? And the inside face then has all the quotes by his contemporaries. And some of these are pretty powerful, right? I mean, It's when we were working on this, Donald Trump was president, and it was the same things that they were saying. He will be better. Once he becomes president, he will become presidential. We can work with him. They were saying the same thing about Woodrow Wilson. But again, none of these things came out. But education, labor policy, the role of government, foreign policy, women's suffrage, race and segregation, civil liberty, all of these things are part of his legacy. And so the piece sits quietly within the middle of campus, and once you pass the fountain, it's a sentinel. It reflects everything around, the glass on the outside. So his words are diminished by the reflection, but on the inside, it's very different. And so you have to get up really, really close to kind of see. But on the inside, you begin to kind of see that moment as you look up, you can interpret all of the writings and images of his contemporaries. And it's a place, almost like a place for debate, right? It's a place that's provocative, that you go, you read, and you might have discussions with someone around. Once this was built, the students said, we still want his name off the building. And then 2020 happened, George Floyd happened. And when George Floyd happened, the university reconciled and they met again. And one of the trustees went out and she started to read. And she started to read some of the things, and she changed the vote. So his name is off of the building. The building is now the School of Public Policy. Woodrow Wilson's name is not affiliated. There is a history. You can go to a website. And I'm not saying the piece helped, but the space helped to have a discussion around removal. So in a way, the piece is, for me, a temporary act, right? It can exist for a long time, but more, it now pays homage to the detractors, the people who were asking him. So as you, in the middle, there is this set of images that move, dichroic images. So we have Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells. So in a way, it's a monument to people who basically wanted him to change, because his words disappear on the outside and the faces become anew on the inside. And their words are still very powerful, reflecting the context. And then you look from one side to the other, it reflects in itself and the sky. And this was opening day, which was fantastic. And the president came out and people were, ah! I had never had an opening day like this ever, and I don't want one like this again. Yeah? But this is called Double Sights. And the last project I want to share with you is in South Carolina. It's the museum, it's the International African American Museum. It's located in Charleston. And again, in America, this is a new discovery. 10 years ago, someone found a map, and the map showed a wharf, and the wharf was called Gadsden's Wharf. And they said, that sounds familiar. And as they did the research, this was the place where the slave ships from the Dutch and from Africa across the Atlantic landed. And we now think 50% of all slaves that came to America landed here. So this would be like Plymouth Rock. This would be like a colonial town, but it never existed. And you think, well, why did they not want this place to be there? Prior to working here, I spent time on 2 art festivals, and this is one installation we did. We grew rice here because the city is a wetland, and the slaves that came here helped to create a billion-dollar industry called Carolina Gold Rice. And this display was about showing how that cultivation happened and how you can take the water out of a wetland, but it will still be a wetland. So the museum opens up next month on this day. So if you are in America, go to Charleston to see this museum, because it will be very different than the National Museum. This will be a place to understand and appreciate American history, particularly in the Low Country. Charleston's a very fascinating place. It is, at the turn of the 20th century, the fathers got together, meaning white guys got together, and they said, We must, because Charleston and New York were the two largest slave places. New York had more slaves coming in than Charleston. So you don't even know it in New York anymore. But here they said we have to change the history. So they decided to say we're the oldest town in America, which is a lie, right? The Spanish were there earlier in St. Augustine in Florida, so it's older. But Charleston says we are the oldest city, and we cannot mention slavery. So they only say we had servants. So it's written, you can find the writing, you can only say, oh, the servants' quarters. And so for almost 100 years, this has been true. The site is located right at the edge. We find the map. The map shows that there was a warehouse. The boats would come in from the Atlantic. They would incubate the enslaved out at the harbor. They would wait to make sure they were healthy. They would bring them here, put them in the warehouse, and wait to sell. They never sold them like in the day, right? The slaves were there, and so they would you would receive a time and place, and you would go to get the slaves. Unlike in Alabama and other places where it was very visible, in Charleston it was very secret. But we found the site, we did the archaeology, now we know where the line is. We dig 2.5 meters down, and we find all the relics from the warehouse, plates, rings, and things like that are interned back. The building is designed by Harry Cobb, Pay Cobb Freed. His partner designed the Louvre, so that's of importance. He just passed away, so this is his last building. The building is long as a football pitch, so it is very long. It's like 150 yards long, and it sits up off the ground because of the hurricane. And below is the hallowed ground. It's almost like a memorial. It reminds me of the memorial to the Jewish genocide as you go out of Rome, and this was a project Harry liked very much, and he would talk about a lot. So the ground plane we make out of shells. We take shells from the Atlantic Ocean, the bottom, and we make a paving because the slaves made a paving called tabby. And to the north, we talk about the landscape, and to the south, we talk about the enslaved. It's open, there is no fences. And this is becoming very controversial now because 2 blocks away is the church where the young white man from North Carolina came and killed the people in the church. And then last weekend in Texas, migrants were on the road and someone in the car drove them over. And so now in America, security is very high, but we're hoping we don't put up walls and this will stay open. On the city side, we create these kind of over-exaggerated dunes because that used to be the edge of the city, and it kind of creates almost like a caress as you look back. It creates a field that changes how you interpret the city. To the north, the various gardens come out from under the building. We talk about the ethnobotanics. A lot of the slaves would bring seeds in their hair and the different plants, things for medicinal purposes. There are steles that make sound of the different tribes that came. And one of the centerpieces is a reproduction of this map. This is a very famous map of the boat from boat from the north of Europe that shows the slaves laid out head to toe. And I was intrigued by, at the museum, instead of using the real one, they use a bad one. But what's beautiful about this, it's a nice cartoon. It looks like textile. So from that, we made concrete, and then we made the body 2 meters, and then we pushed the shell inside the body so that it's about that thick, and we then created a fountain. And this fountain will flood, and when the water goes away, you see the bodies. Yeah? So when you look back out, these were the early images. You look out towards the harbor, sometimes it's this, and sometimes it's the bodies. And you see like 50 yards of bodies on the ground. And what's nice, it's facing east, and the water is always moving. It's always moving. And the bodies are made of the same tabby, right? And so it has a kind of a visceral color where it's almost as if you're looking at skeletons on the ground. And again, the shells are from the ocean. So you can imagine the people who died in the ocean, now their shells are part of the ground. And when you look in different ways, it has a different interpretation. But I'm more interested in the shadow, the puddles that get caught in between, and the way the light changes across the surface. And the abstraction that starts to happen at different levels. And even without water, there is a kind of a mystery to the surface. And behind, there is a wall where the warehouse was. We don't own all the property. And here, we created a gauntlet where you have to now walk through and past these figures that are metamorphosing, because the scholars, when we talk, when the slaves arrived to Charleston, they were not African. And when they're in the warehouse, they were becoming, right? And so not until they left did they actually become Americans. And so this is a place you walk through. It's a very kind of visceral place with a reflection, and you are there with the rice Negroes. The space is, you can go up to the building and look back down, and you have the experience of the entire piece. Inside, there are 3 main galleries, one that talks about the Atlantic crossing, one that talks about Charleston. There is a family center where you can go and find with your DNA, you can find who your relatives were as well. And this is the view from the outside looking back. And you can kind of see all of them, the gardens on one side, the warehouse on the other, and the fountain that sits, how the building sits up off the ground. And every morning as the sun rises, there's this moment, right, where you're looking back to Africa, and the sun is rising up through the palm trees, which don't grow here. These palms grow in Africa. So we're, again, thinking about how we think of natives. Thank you.